Alright, there we go. Easy peasy. When you actually hit the boss and you actually get to do damage, he gets deleted in 2 seconds. Yo, what is going on, YouTube? Welcome back to yet another update to my Explode Invoker build. This time around, I'm using a new build that is taking advantage of the Keystone Chaos Inoculation. So this is a version of the build which, in effect, makes its life become 1 to become immune to chaos damage. So in this version of the build, you won't have to worry about chaos damage at all. You won't have to get any chaos resistance on your gear. But the downside is your life becomes 1. So how do we solve this problem? We don't want to be running around with just 1 life. To solve this, we are going to get another form of defense that is going to protect our life called Energy Shield. And we can get this a lot of places on the tree, as well as we can get it on our gear here. So you have gear with both evasion, armor, and energy shield. But for this build, we're going to be looking for energy shield. So the idea of this build is we drop all chaos resistance off our gear, and we also drop all life off of our gear. Those are 2 stats that provide no value to us anymore. And we are looking for gear that has as much energy shield as possible, as well as, sufficient attributes and resistances to, be able to play the build with capped resistances, as well as with all our skills active. So that is, that is not changing. That is staying the same as before, but now we don't care about life or chaos res. So I'm going to go over what I've done to make this kind of work out pretty well for the build, and how it feels, and kind of the pros and cons versus of this version versus the previous version. So this version of the build, obviously, one big pro is you do not have to worry about chaos res at all. You can have negative chaos res like I have here, and that does not matter because we're immune. So that's one big upside. The downside, one of the downsides of this version is because we're not going to be getting as much evasion rating on our body armor, since now we're focused more on energy shield, we're not going to really benefit much from this protect me from harm point. If I was to take this point that gives me 40% less evasion rating, my evade chance would go from 80% down to like 40%. So I would lose a lot of evasion rating and not be able to evade attacks nearly as often. So the build has to drop that ascendancy point, and in favor of meditate, which is allowing us, if we meditate, to generate up to double our current energy shield. And that is a good protection against one-shots, and while mapping will allow us to be sitting at least for me, at nearly 9,000 energy shield, which is a massive amount. It's unlikely you'll get one shot with that amount. So you're pretty safe, you're pretty tanky, you're pretty unkillable in maps. And this synergizes really well with our aura here, Grim Feast, which now that we have more intelligence in the build, which I'll explain later, we can level this up to now give nearly 200 energy shield back when killing enemies and picking up these Grim Remnants. So as we're killing enemies, we're gaining 200 energy shield back, and that can overflow up to nearly 9,000. So we are basically immortal while mapping. The one downside is whenever you leave a map, your energy shield resets back to its base value of 4,300 here. So you would have to cast Meditate whenever you go back into the map, whenever you're going in and out of the portals, which can take a few seconds out of your mapping, of your mapping speed time, which is kind of annoying, but it is definitely worth it for the defensive layer it is adding. I have tried and I shall rage, but this one is actually somehow worse because I rarely ever remember to activate it while mapping, and not that I even need to activate it because I have plenty of damage without it. But then when I go in for the boss kill in maps that have map bosses, it's usually either not charged up yet, or I've left the map through a portal to go stash gear or stash items I found in the map. And whenever you leave the map, whenever you go through a portal, it resets. So a lot of the times I'll go into the boss room and, well, looks like my Unbound Avatar is not built up. And the time it takes to build it up against the boss takes way too long. We probably will only, if it's a really long boss fight, we'll only be able to activate it near the end of the fight anyway. So I didn't feel like this was great value for those reasons. If they would allow you to keep your Unbound Avatar at 100 stacks after leaving through a portal, if they made that small change and allowed you to maintain it, I would definitely recommend it. It could be pretty strong. It would allow you to get a lot more boss damage because you'll have it up for pretty much every boss fight. Because I never use it while mapping, but on bosses, I could see you having 40% more elemental damage would definitely help kill them faster. But because of the current state of the game, where I have to go through my portals to stash the gear and loot I find in maps like 3 or 4 times per map, since I'm finding so much loot, this is almost never active, and I keep forgetting to click it anyway. So it's just not needed. So meditate, at least we can use this when going back into the map to get back to that 8,000. And you can also use it right before a boss fight to have, you know, that big 8,000 energy shield to protect you from being one shot. So I like that. So basically, let me go over the skill tree and what I've changed. So basically, we're taking a lot of the same points we were taking before, but now we're coming over here and we're starting to grab these increased maximum energy shield points that are going to help us get that big value we want to have. And I kind of opted for more damage, but there are some other good points here. If you want to be a little tankier, you can take pure energy. Otherwise, a lot of the points have stayed the same. Now moving down here, because we're going Chaos Inoculation, we have to move up here to grab it. And then we also want to come up here to grab all this extra energy shield up here. And then since we're already in this area, there are some really good points like 2% increased lightning damage per intelligence. We're getting a lot more intelligence because of ingenuity here. So this just happens to be a good area to be taking these points, as well as we are right next to Whispers of Doom, allowing us to apply 2 curses, which is really, really handy and will help a lot on boss fights. We can now apply both conductivity to reduce their lightning resistance, but also enfeeble, which is going to make the boss do less damage, which is really nice. So we have to path up here, and all these travel points, since it's pretty far away, are going to make it so we can spend less points on the south end of the tree, which we normally liked to spend points at. So basically what we've changed is we've now made use of a unique jewel called Controlled Metamorphosis, and you can either use the large ring version or the medium large ring version, and using it here in this slot gives a lot of value. It basically allows you to select any of the Atlas or any of the passive tree points within this ring and allocate them without having to do the travel points leading up to them. So we are grabbing Falcon Technique, Proficiency, Bestial Skin, Maiming Strike, and Escape Velocity, 5 points that we normally would have to spend a lot of points to get to by just using this jewel. And because this jewel has a massive minus to chaos resistance, it's not too bad in a CI build because we don't care about chaos resistance. We're immune to chaos damage. But it also can have a minus to all elemental resistances. So this is the stat that you're going to look out for. You want to find one that isn't too punishing here. Otherwise, it's going to be kind of difficult to cap your elemental resistances. So I have a nice perfectly rolled one here with -5 to all elemental resistances. And then again, the chaos res I do not care about. So that is how we're saving a lot of travel points and kind of making up for all the travel points we have to use to come up here. But otherwise, the tree is relatively similar. One thing to note is I'm taking Unbound Forces over here because I need the extra chill magnitude since I don't have any flat cold damage on any of my gear, either my weapon or my ring, which is kind of preventing me from getting consistent chills, which is what you need to make this ring feel really nice to use. So if you have either flat cold damage on your weapon or on your ring, you probably wouldn't need to go over here to grab the Unbound Forces, and you can instead take the damage versus full life enemies, this first approach set of points here, which is going to increase your clear speed in maps quite a bit. It's 120% increased damage against enemies when you hit them for the first time, which your explode chains are going to be hitting them for the first time all the time. So this is getting a lot of value. So that's an option if you don't need the extra chill magnitude. So otherwise the tree is relatively similar besides those changes. The one big change though is now that we are using these unique gloves, which grant us a lot of extra flat lightning damage per intelligence, and like I said, we're getting a lot more intelligence on the tree, we are getting enough flat lightning damage to not really have to rely on our Shattering Palm damage nearly as much. Our Shattering Palm is less important. I've dropped a lot of my skill levels. Now it's only level 24, so the damage has dropped way, way down. It used to be like 60,000 or something. Now it's at 14,000. It's much less, but in exchange, our Herald damage has gone up quite a lot because we're getting so much flat lightning damage that is then being applied to those Heralds. My Herald of Ice here nearly has the same amount of lightning damage as it does normally have cold damage, which is crazy. And this allows for some nifty things. So first of all, you can put Innervate on your Herald of Ice, and it'll be able to consistently shock enemies, giving you pretty much 100% uptime on that buff. And we are able to shock enemies by using Conduction, which is increasing our shock chance. It makes it really easy to shock enemies. We're still using Long Shot, Heft, and Magnified effects because now we're clearing screens with Herald of Ice and not Shattering Palm as much. We want it to have more AoE so it can travel further. So this is the setup I recommend on Herald of Ice. And then Herald of Thunder, Elemental Focus, Lightning Mastery, Lightning Infusion, and Shock Siphon is going to allow us, when we kill shocked enemies, to gain some of that energy shield back. So if we actually get hit hard enough to be below our cap, we'll be able to get some of that back. And this is effectively working as our recovery on top of already using Grim Feast. So we have a lot of recovery in the build. And our Herald of Thunder is hitting quite hard here at like 20,000. And because our Herald of Ice is able to shock, we are actually getting very good uptime on our Herald of Thunder. It is triggering a lot. It is triggering on almost every enemy because we're constantly killing shocked enemies. So both Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder are constantly activating, and this is where all the clear speed is coming from. Now, this is a high investment version of the build. And this requires stuff like these unique gloves, that unique jewel I showed. And so this is not something you could really set up on a budget. This is something that you transition to way, way later when you have a lot of money. I don't know how much I invested into this. It's probably upwards of 20 to 30 divines to get this running smoothly. And also I bought this new expensive weapon, which I'll explain later. But yeah, so because we're getting so much more flat damage and Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder are doing so much more of the legwork to carry us with the clear speed, we don't really need Herald of Ash anymore. And so I've been able to, with a really nice hybrid body armor here, get enough spirit to drop Herald of Ash, and instead I am running Blink. And this just makes getting around the map, getting over those annoying ledges, closing those gaps in breaches where there's no enemies, much, much more convenient and much easier, and is really, really, it feels really nice to use. And on boss fights, it's really easy to dodge boss mechanics because, you know, you're teleporting away from them instead of just rolling. So I really like Blink. It fits really well into the build. And we're using Ingenuity, Second Wind, and Arcane Tempo, just giving us more cast speed and allowing us to use it more often. Pretty straightforward. Wind Dancer's not really changed much. I'm using Clarity and Precision now because I've been able to get enough spirit to run both. And then Ghost Stance has stayed the same. Grim Feast is the same. We're not running Cannibalism anymore because life regeneration is useless if you only have one life. So yeah, that's kind of useless. So you can take that out. Hand of Chola. So now that we have the Whispers of Doom keystone up here, we're able to use 2 curses. And this allows us to put both Conductivity and Enfeeble into our Hand of Chola. And so it'll be applying both of those curses on the boss, as well as our Mark. And then I'm using Heightened Curse to kind of mitigate the downside here of using Hand of Chola with a reduced effect. And then I'm also using Chaos Mastery to again give it another level so that it has less reduced effect. And then finally, our main setup. Our main setup hasn't really changed. I'm using Martial Tempo, Concentrated Effect, Inspiration, and now I'm using Rage and Overcharge in Stormwave because the costs got kind of out of hand, especially when you're scaling levels. And these don't have any cost, but they still increase our damage quite a bit. Having 30 Rage is a massive damage multiplier, and having bigger shocks on enemies gives us a lot more single target damage. So even though these don't have any cost multipliers and don't give any immediate damage up front, they end up being really high value for boss fights and for just getting the maximum amount of damage there. Shattering Palm, this is less important now. We're using this mainly to sometimes trigger Ice Bite to get that buff up, as well as to close gaps between packs of enemies. But the damage here has way fallen off, so it's less of the focus of our clear skill now. Our clear skill is the Heralds, and the Shattering Palm is just there to kind of, you know, close distance and activate Ice Bite. So we're using Ice Bite, Cold Mastery, Close Combat since we're going to be teleporting in melee range, so this is always going to give us 25% more damage. And then Momentum. Because I'm usually using this to close the distance between packs of enemies, we're usually going to be dashing at least 2 meters. So this will be 40% more damage when dashing at least 2 meters. So this is one that's nice to use. And then finally, Rising Tempest, because now that we're using Rage and Overcharge here in Stormwave, we've moved Rising Tempest down to still get some decent value here out of that one. So that's the setup. Another option here might be to do like Cold Penetration or something if you want your Shattering Palm to be better against rares, because I tend to use it on rares to help me get some more single target damage, because the Heralds are on death effects, so they're not great at like killing rares, but the Shattering Palm can be triggered to explode when you deal enough damage, so you can at least Shattering Palm onto a rare and then trigger that to get a little bit more burst. So you could use Cold Penetration instead of Rising Tempest if you like, but yeah, I like this setup. I've had no issues with rares. They're dying in pretty much one hit still. All right, so that's the tree. Those are the skills. I'll go over the gear a little bit more in detail. So I've actually ended up swapping out my weapon. I used to use a +6 level weapon, but that was scaling the mana cost to be way too high for my liking. My Stormwave mana cost was like double what it is now. It was like 90 or something. So I instead went for a weapon that has a lot more flat damage and attack speed. And the reason for this is not necessarily because I had trouble with mapping. So this one has 767 damage per second. And it's not necessarily because I had mana issues while mapping. Mana issues while mapping were never really a problem, especially if you had the mana recover on kill on either your jewel or one on your ring or your gloves. That was never an issue. But the issue was on bosses, especially if you're going with like the Tempest spell setup. Putting down those bells was like 400 mana per bell, and then attacks were 100 mana per attack. And you could see with only 1,000 mana pool that you would run out of mana pretty much instantly on bosses, and then you'd be stuck there waiting for your mana regenerate, or you'd have to spam your mana flask, which was really annoying. So I instead decided to lose a little bit of damage. I have another weapon here I can show you, which was my old weapon, and I'll show you what happens here when I equip my old weapon. So my old weapon, let me turn the aura or the heralds off because I think I have I have attributes on my weapon. But okay, so basically the damage is going to go down slightly. So see how my +6 weapon here gives me 5,000 more damage, but also is costing 89 mana. So I'm making a trade-off here of having a little bit less damage, but a much more sustainable mana cost. And I think it's definitely worth it when you're in this high investment version of the build, because we're not needing Shattering Palms level to be dealing like good AoE damage. We're able to clear screens with just the heralds. So level scaling is less important now for us that we're in the high investment stage and we're making good use of all the flat damage that these gloves are giving us. So I mean, this is a big investment build. Like these gloves here with the +1 to all melee skills, these were like 12 divines when I bought them. And the uncorrupted versions that don't have increased levels, those can also be like at least 10 divines. So it's a big cost investment to even get started with this version. So keep that in mind. This is a late game, end game kind of something you transition into. All right, so because we're trying to make more use of our heralds and scale our flat damage to allow them to kill enemies for us, we are basically wanting a weapon with a lot more flat damage and attack speed for bell trigger rate, but don't care nearly as much about the levels to skills. So that is what we're trading here. We're trading a little bit of damage for much lower mana costs and probably similar bell damage, since this attack speed is going to allow us to trigger that bell more often. So the bell damage is probably going to be around the same, but we're overall going to have way better mana costs and not be running out of mana instantly in boss encounters. Now, because we're using this same weapon for both mapping and bossing, because it's playing both roles, we are going to do an interesting little weapon swap setup that I'll show you now. So because we're using basically the same weapon now for both mapping and bossing, how can we make use of the weapon set points available to us to get some extra value? So here, as you can see, I have some weapon set points for my second weapon, which I only ever swap to when using my Hand of Chayola. And that is the skill that we're using to apply both curses, 2 of them, and a mark. So basically, I call this the curse swap. So we only swap to this weapon when we curse a boss, and this swap is giving us a ton of extra curse effect, curse duration, as well as down here we're getting mark effect, a bunch of mark effect, as well as some nice things like enemies you mark cannot deal critical hits. And because we have decent duration on our mark, this means like for the next 10 seconds after using our Hand of Chayola, the boss will be extremely weakened. They'll have like a 25% enfeeble, which is reducing their damage to you by 25%. They'll have their resistances removed by around 47% for me, so 40% resistance removed. And then they will also be unable to crit you. And you'll also be able to apply a much bigger shock, because as we can see here with Voltaic Mark, this allows you to apply a much bigger shock. So currently I think my shock is over 80% when I use my Voltaic mark on a boss with this swap setup, because we're getting a lot of mark effect. So this is a really interesting way to make use of our second weapon, even though we are using primarily our main weapon, our first weapon, on pretty much all content, including bosses and mapping. We are only swapping to our second weapon for one skill, which is applying a curse or 2 curses and a mark. So this is the curse swap, and this is going to help us with single target damage, as well as, preventing us from taking critical hits, and Enfeeble preventing us from taking as much damage. So it's really nice to have for bosses. I don't really use this outside of bosses, but for bosses it's huge. To make this work though, we're gonna wanna make sure that we don't accidentally stay on that weapon swap, because this weapon swap, where we're swapping to all the mark effect and curse effect, is swapping off of all of our damage, because we don't care about the damage on the Hand of Chiola. That's just there to apply the curses and the mark. So we're swapping off all this lightning damage here, all this lightning damage here, some attack damage down here, some more attack damage here. We're basically dropping all of our damage temporarily to apply a really big couple curses and mark. And then we want to swap as soon as we can right back to our damage weapon. And to do that, we're going to use something called smart swapping. So basically you can decide which weapon is going to be used for certain skills. If we put the weapon set 2 here for Hand of Chiola, it'll always switch to our curse setup when we use it. And then when we switch to other weapons or other skills, when we switch to other skills, it'll automatically switch back to our main damage weapon, which is our weapon set 1. So make sure you have this set up. I've made some mistakes today on stream where I forgot to do this, and I would go in with Hand of Chiola and then start hitting the boss and wonder why all my mana is draining and why I do 0 damage. Well, it's because I was still on my plus 6 weapon that, you know, makes my mana cost unsustainable, as well as all my damage on my tree was gone. So, you know, you can see how that was a big mistake. But I fixed that since then, and now it's feeling really, really smooth. And there is a slight delay. There's a slight weapon swap delay, so you'll have to wait like maybe a quarter second to swap to the Hand of Chiola weapon, and then another quarter second to swap back to your main weapon. But at the start of a boss fight, they're usually doing some like animation, and they're like readying up to start attack you, so they don't actually start hitting you, and you can usually afford that like half a second of delay, so it's not too bad. Plus, we're getting a lot of curse duration up here, so our curses end up lasting like 13 seconds. So it's 13 seconds between having to do that again, so it's not too bad. But yeah, we usually kill the boss within that time frame. Pinnacle bosses are going to be a little bit different, but map bosses are dying within that 13 seconds, so it's no issue. And then if you were to bring the bell setup into a map boss, I mean, they're dying within 2 seconds. Like, we're deleting them immediately. But if you want to go with the bell setup into a pinnacle boss, I'm not sure if you could kill them in 13 seconds. Probably not. Maybe the earlier difficulties you could, but the harder difficulties get like exponentially more HP. You'll probably have to curse them a few times throughout the fight. But like I said, the duration is really nice. It's like 13 or 14 seconds, so you don't have to do it too often. You'll probably just go in with your Hand of Chiola as your gap closer to get next to the boss and then start dropping bells. So it'll naturally already be being used for that purpose. All right, so that's the build. That's the CI setup. I would say it's not really superior in any real way to the previous version. It's just different. We are able to get more rarity on our gear instead of life and chaos res, and we are trading off being immune to chaos damage versus being very we're a lot more susceptible to physical damage than we were before. I think personally, this is a setup I'll be using for mapping because I'm getting so much more rarity on my gear, and so I'm making more currency. But for the bossing setup, I probably would want to swap back to the evasion stacking setup, because the protect me from harm point gives you so much value on these pinnacle bosses. A lot of the pinnacle bosses, at least Zesh, I know for a fact, does a good amount of physical damage, and having like 75% physical damage reduction allows you to tank skills that would normally one-shot you. So personally, I feel like I much prefer the other version for pinnacle bosses, but this version is definitely, if you're able to get it set it up the way I have it, is going to be nice for mapping for that increased item rarity on gear. But keep in mind that this is a very high investment build that you cannot achieve without, you know, putting 20-30 divines into your character. So this is something to try to look forward to. I wouldn't try to start out with this setup, because you're going to need a really good weapon, first of all, because since we lost so much damage from losing those levels, we want to have a really good weapon here. And this weapon was, I think, 10 divines to purchase. So yeah, really expensive. But yeah, that's the CI setup. All right, we got the breach here. All right, guys, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. And of course, I will be updating my mobalytics guide with a section called Chaos Inoculation, where you can go and check all the relevant details to this version of the build. And that will be the most updated version if I decide to make some further changes. But until then, take care, have a good one, and I'll catch you guys next time.